Hi, this is Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, with Sheldon Richmond, the vice president of the foundation, and this is the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day that you don't get in the mainstream television programs and the mainstream newspapers. Hey, Sheldon, recently there was an op-ed by John Yoo, who, of course, worked in the Department of Justice under the Bush administration, sort of poo-pooing the fact that the Russian government had placed him on a effectively no-fly list or no-come-to-Russia list because of the accusation that he had participated in the torture regime under the Bush administration. And it seems like Putin was retaliating because the U.S. was condemning Russia based on improper investigation into the death of a lawyer, a very suspicious death, I should say, a young lawyer who was in a Russian prison and mysteriously died of a heart attack or something like that, even though he was in his 30s or something. And so they were retaliating and putting sanctions on Russia, the U.S. officials were, and they listed 10 or 15 people that couldn't travel to the United States anymore. So they were retaliating, and you over there is making light of this and poo-pooing it in this op-ed in the Wall Street Journal saying, well, I guess I can't go do jujitsu with Putin anymore. But he may not be making so much light of it after all, because I read in the media recently where George W. Bush canceled a trip to Europe out of fear that he would be indicted, arrested, and punished for the torture that was done under his regime. So I have a feeling that a lot of these U.S. officials under Bush may be scared to travel, and I got a feeling that you might himself not be traveling overseas. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's right. Putin, it may be hypocritical for Putin to be accusing people of wrongdoing, since he's got a lot of wrongdoing of his own under his belt. But that doesn't wipe out a larger point. In fact, there was a page one story in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago pointing out that an organization known as the Constitution Project had a task force on torture primarily during the Bush years, and it basically indicted, not in the legal sense, but indicted the Bush administration and high Bush officials for systematic use of torture in violation of U.S. law and international law, and spelled out in great detail what went on with a dozen or more findings, talking about everything from Guantanamo to Abu Ghraib and so-called enhanced interrogation. This made page one of the New York Times. Unfortunately, it made page one of the New York Times on April 16th. April 16th, which happened to be the day after the Boston Marathon bombing. So the story got completely overshadowed by what happened the day before, and of course that dominated the news for days afterwards. It's still in the news. And then it got a little bit more overshadowed when the Bush Library was opened in Dallas. And so this unfortunately went down the memory hole. I tried to resurrect it with an article on Friday, spelling out in some detail what this project's task force documented. Now they didn't have access to classified information, so they used whatever was open, and I guess they talked to some people, and they spell out how horrible this has been. The U.S. government is in violation of both its own law and international laws, and I'm not surprised that Bush had to cancel that. He was going to Switzerland to speak to a pro-Israel organization, but at the same time, Amnesty International and other groups over there were calling for an investigation of Bush's conduct, because that's in violation, and he can be arrested extraterritorially, because it's a violation of an international convention signed by the U.S. on torture, which obligates the U.S. government to do all kinds of things, not only to abstain from torture, but to investigate and prosecute people who are alleged to have conducted torture, American officials, which means even the Obama administration is in violation of this international convention.
Yeah, I find that report fascinating in one respect, that these are mainstream people that conducted this investigation and this report. I mean, these are not just some, a group of libertarians or whatever. These are mainstream public officials. I'm not government officials, but some of them are former government officials, and they made no bones about it. They said the U.S. government under the Bush administration and has engaged in torture. And so here you have, a fairly, semi-official finding that that's exactly what happened. And as you point out, this triggers international agreements to which the United States has bound itself with respect to torture. And one of those agreements is that they prosecute people, including government officials, who have engaged in torture. And clearly Obama has not done that. The Justice Department has not done that, which opens up the possibility of the International Criminal Court or some other tribunal. Because let's face it, if the U.S. isn't going to enforce these agreements and prosecute the people that are involved in torture, what resort do people have internationally except to bring these people to justice in an international tribunal? And clearly Bush is afraid of that. Otherwise, he would have said, look, I haven't engaged in torture, or I tortured, but it was justified. I'm going to travel wherever I want, and I'll face the music. I'm not afraid to face justice in any court anywhere in the world. But clearly he is afraid to face justice. Otherwise, he would not have canceled that trip. And imagine that. A former president of the United States is not able to travel overseas for fear of being arrested, indicted, convicted, and incarcerated for having tortured people in violation of the law. That's amazing to me, Sheldon.
Yeah, I mean, I go further. You said including government officials. It's about government officials. I mean, if some private person tortures, kidnaps somebody and tortures them, I don't think that's, obviously the local police would handle such a thing. I don't think that affects this international agreement. This is about government conduct, government activity. It's aimed at government officials. So, it's even stronger. About the Constitution Project, and the task force in particular, it was co-chaired by Asa Hutchinson. Asa Hutchinson is a Republican, a former member of Congress. Under Bush, he was an undersecretary of Department of Homeland Security, and he also, under Bush, ran the Drug Enforcement Administration. So he's got very good credentials in that sense, right? This was not an offshoot of Amnesty International or a libertarian organization. Another member of the task force was William Sessions, a former director of the FBI. So that's the type of person who sat on this task force. Richard Epstein, by the way, the generally libertarian lawyer, a law professor now at New York University, also was on this task force. There were some problems in the task force report. We can get into that if you want, particularly about Guantanamo. But another thing that this task force indicted the administration, and this would include the Obama administration for, under the Convention Against Torture, which the U.S. is a signatory to, the courts have to be open to victims of people who allege they were victims of official torture. They're supposed to be allowed to go into court suing and getting some kind of compensation. And the Obama administration has consistently and successfully, unfortunately, argued to the courts that these cases should not be heard because of state secrets, because it would reveal, any one of these cases would reveal information the U.S. government says is classified and shouldn't be revealed. Now this is, and I believe Bush kind of started this precedent. But, previously, if you have a case against the government that involved classified information, the case didn't get thrown out of court. It's just that any classified information, any evidence that consisted of classified information would be presented in a closed session to the judge in order to keep the information from being made public. But it wasn't grounds for killing the suit. Bush and especially Obama now use that as grounds for killing the suit. This should not be heard, period, because of the nature of the evidence. And the courts have been deferring to the administrations on this. That's a violation of the International Convention because the courts are supposed to be open to victims of torture.
Yeah, I think it's clear that the whole thing from the very beginning is just involved cover-up and protection of people that knowingly have violated the law. And let's face it, Bush has a well-justified fear of being prosecuted, and even the fact that he may protect himself by not traveling overseas. At least he also has to worry about some future administration, unlike the Obama administration, that says, I am going to enforce the law. We're a nation of laws. We bind ourselves by international agreement. And this could be 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road. I mean, look what happened with Pinochet, whose regime had been torturing people and killing people and so forth. He ends up under indictment over in London, and an extradition request from a Spanish judge based on the fact that he had done this to Spanish citizens. And right now there's a trial going on in Guatemala and under one of the military henchmen there that was ruling the country, after the U.S. had ousted the democratically elected president of the country and had a succession of U.S.-supported military dictators. Many years later, after that guy, committed supposedly genocide around Guatemala, he's now being brought to face justice. And you see it again in Argentina. Many years after the war there and the atrocities there under the military regime. So the nice thing is that these people that have engaged in these violations of law, while they may get away in the short term, they can't rest assured that that's going to be forever. And also in the short term, as we've seen, they have to worry about some international tribunal taking them into custody.
Yeah, I think they have more to worry about internationally than domestically. I would think the chances of their ever being investigated and indicted in the U.S. Are close to zero. I just don't see that happening. Don't forget, they weren't running a military coup like some Central American or South American countries. But I think they do have to worry. Rumsfeld also canceled a trip some years ago for a very similar reason. And so, we can take some measure of satisfaction in the fact that these guys and women, because Condi Rice, I would put Condoleezza Rice in this category, can't travel abroad safely. They don't have the peace of mind, and maybe that means they can't travel abroad at all. And if that's what we get as punishment, it's minor punishment, I agree, but I still take some satisfaction because these people, they're all big shots. They're full of themselves. They want to travel. They want to be treated like elder statesmen. And if they can't leave the country, that's going to bother them. So I'll take a little bit of joy in that. I hope I hope there's more than that, because justice requires more than that. Two other parts of this report I think are worth pointing out, and this brings back John Yoo. It says that the lawyers that came up with the justifications for this are culpable as well, and they condemn them very strongly. The ones that cooked up the legal justification for this. So that's good. That means that you, they didn't name names, but you is in the spotlight. The people that told Bush and the others that, you could do this. It's not torture. Here's how you can do this. They're on the hook. And the other people that are on the hook, and I was very happy to see this, are the medical people and the so-called mental health people who cooperated in the interrogations, both in devising methods and in refusing to report abuses, which under their code of ethics, they are obliged to do. And it, like I said, it didn't name names, but it specifically said these medical people and alleged mental health people, I call them alleged for good reason, but no time to go into now, those people are also participants, and they violated their own code of ethics. And I was very happy to see that.
Yeah, it was a brilliant.
Happy to see them condemned.
Yeah, it was
happy
a brilliant. Yeah, it was a brilliant little scheme that they had. That 9/11 happens, and they now are going to open up the floodgates on torture, which of course they had been supporting prior to 9/11. If you look at the regimes that they helped install into power, the Pinochet regime, the Shah of Iran, the longtime support of Mubarak in Egypt. I mean, they believed in torture. They supported the regimes that were engaged in this stuff. And so 9/11 simply opens it up and makes it public and lets U.S. officials do what their pro-U.S. regimes had been doing for decades. And it was a brilliant little scheme. They engage in this, but they look to the lawyers and say, give us the legal justification for this. So the lawyers come up with this contorted definition that totally changed the meaning of the word torture. And I think it was something like, if it brings death, that's torture. Otherwise, it's fine, or some variation on that. And so then when it all comes to light, the Bush can say, well, gosh, the lawyers said it was legal, and then we can't impeach you or whatever because you relied on lawyers' advice. And the lawyers are sitting there saying, hey, we're just giving an opinion. We're not involved with carrying out the torture. You can't hold us responsible for just making an opinion. So the bottom line is nobody's held responsible. And then the other telling part of this whole thing is when they destroy those torture tapes, the CIA does. I mean, if a private citizen destroyed evidence like that, I mean, he'd find himself in the federal penitentiary for umpteen years for obstruction of justice. These guys knowingly destroyed the tapes, and of course they were recording, videotaping the waterboarding that they were putting these people under. Well, the fact that they destroy the tape, Sheldon, is an implicit acknowledgement that they knew they were doing something wrong. And I'm glad you mentioned the doctors, because it's really a succession, in my opinion, of MK Ultra. When the CIA was engaged in all those drug experiments on unsuspecting Americans and the LSD experiments on children, and then as soon as it comes to light, they order a total destruction of all the MK Ultra files, including the names of the patients, what they were doing to them with the drugs, the LSDs, and their rationale was, well, the public just wouldn't understand. I mean, this is national security. And I think that's exactly what was going through their mind when they destroyed these torture videotapes. Oh, the public just won't understand. We're doing it to protect them. And correct me if I'm wrong, but in that report that we've been talking about, their conclusion was that all that torture produced no valuable evidence at all. And that a lot of times it was false evidence because the guy would say, I'll give you whatever you want, just stop torturing me.
No, they did take that up, the idea about the effectiveness of it, which they didn't make central, but they did address it, and they did go through reports and things that were not classified, coming from the government, which showed that you couldn't make a good case that they got valuable information or much information from that. They even disputed the idea that torture led to the locating of Osama bin Laden, and they referred to a Senate committee that investigated this, which did have access to classified material, that found that there was no evidence that torture even led to bin Laden. We shouldn't think this is all past history. Now, it's bad enough that Obama doesn't want to look backward. He said it's not productive to look backward. That's funny. I don't know. Every criminal now should go into court and say, look, it's not productive to look backward. Let's look ahead. Why are we looking back at what I did last week or 2 weeks ago in robbing a bank or raping somebody? It's not productive. The president says it's not productive. Why is there a double standard for high officials versus American citizens? But even apart from the looking backward, there's bad stuff going on right now. Jeremy Scahill has documented that the U.S. Officials, CIA, are still involved in torture and other forms of enhanced interrogation in Somalia underneath the building of the Somalia security forces. It may not be a U.S. administered prison, I think at one time it was, or anymore, but the U.S. officials, CIA people, are still there in participating in, quote, interrogations. The other thing is Guantanamo. Guantanamo, you have over half of the 166 inmates there on hunger strikes because they have no prospect of getting out. So, many of them, I forget how many, 60 or so, 80 or so, have been cleared for release already, and that was 6 years ago, and still have no sign of getting out. And so they're starving themselves as a protest. And what is the U.S. government doing in the case of at least 20 of them? Force feeding them with a tube up their nose, which is torture, because we had an op-ed just a few weeks ago by one of the inmates talking about the excruciating pain this causes. What has Obama said? All Obama says is, I don't want these people to die. They don't even have the dignity of being allowed to end their own lives. They have no prospect of getting out. Now, the committee, the task force, has an interesting section on Guantanamo. A majority, this is one case where they had a majority report and a minority position and a majority position. The majority of the task force said that Guantanamo should be closed, that the ones cleared for release ought to be released, that the ones that, and then the rest of them should either be tried in military commissions or regular civilian courts. But at least they said get rid of Guantanamo. Unfortunately, two members, a minority report, said no, Guantanamo has to remain open. We just have to leave the people there because they're a threat. And I regret to say that one of the members was Asa Hutchinson, who I've described already, but the other is Richard Epstein. It was a two-man minority that said Guantanamo needs to remain open.
Yeah, I find it fascinating that we're living under a regime that has the strongest military in history. We spend more on the military than all the next 9 or 10 countries combined, and yet people are afraid of 80 to 100 people. Like, what are they going to do? Conquer the United States? It's ridiculous. But, Sheldon, I'd like to take this to a higher level. I mean, we can talk about torture and ending it and so forth, which needs to be done. I mean, these dark side practices are just a moral abomination for the United States. I never, as a kid, ever imagined when I'd read about these horrible tales of torture in medieval times that my government would be engaged in this. I mean, it's absolutely incredible to me that we're even debating it. But let's face it, it's rooted in the terrorist attack of 9/11. At least that's the ostensible excuse for doing this. And I think this takes us to a higher level of what we've talked about ever since 9/11 and before, is what produces this anger and rage that causes people to come over here and engage in anti-American terrorism, and that's the U.S. empire, the military empire, unlimited government overseas. And I think that we've got to always stay focused on that, because it's sort of like the drug war. We can stay focused on all the horrors that the drug dealers are doing and stuff like killing 60,000 Mexicans in the last 6 years. But we stay focused on legalizing drugs because that gets rid of the drug lords, which gets rid of all the violence associated with drug lords. And it's the same argument we've been making on foreign policy. Bring the troops home. And then that diminishes the anger and rage that people have toward the U.S. government, which disintegrates the threat of terrorism, which means there's no more torture necessary. I mean, that's their excuse. We've got to get information out of the terrorists. Well, if there's no more terrorists because you brought back the empire, then you get to the root of the problem.
No, that's a good point. There's a scholar at the University of Chicago named Robert Pate, who's got an institute, an organization, I don't know what he calls it, that has for many years tracked acts of terrorism, in particular suicide bombings, but other acts of terrorism. Not just tracks them, but investigates the cases, and he shows that overwhelmingly what prompts people to do those things are the occupation of their countries and other violence directed at the people in their countries. It's not Muslims being mad that Americans are infidels, or that they have MTV, or that we have a licentious society. That's not what prompts people to kill themselves in attacks. Which don't forget 9/11. Those were suicide attacks. Those people died in knocking down the buildings and hitting the Pentagon. And yet we don't want to learn the lesson. It's acknowledged in the 9/11 report. It's been acknowledged by the Pentagon. It gets acknowledged once in a while by officials. I mean, Paul Wolfowitz once said, the great thing about the Iraq War is that we can take the troops away from Mecca and Medina in Saudi Arabia, the holy sites in Saudi Arabia, and that's been such a source of irritation to Muslims. I mean, there he was confessing that U.S. conduct is what gets people resentful and wanting to have vengeance against Americans. So it's been acknowledged over and over again, even by the officials. But when it's convenient, they sort of forget that and then say, no, it's just they hate us for freedom, or whatever is the case. So I agree with you. We want to understand this so we can get to the root cause of it and eliminate the root cause, not so we can excuse it. There's no excuse for hitting non-combatants, not so we can coddle people that commit wanton violence, but so we can understand it and prevent it in the future. I mean, it seems like just simple common sense.
Yeah, it's saving people's lives. If the U.S. military were over there doing something that was right, we might say, well, okay, that it's doing something right, and therefore maybe the cost in terms of terrorist retaliation is worth it. But the fact is, what they're doing over there is just plain wrong, and that's what I think that it is the duty of the citizenry to examine that there can't be this blind support of government whenever it goes abroad, like it's our team, we got to stand for our team. That it is the duty of the citizen to make a close examination into the government's conduct, especially when that conduct is engendering anger and rage that is then ending up costing American life here in the United States and the lives of the troops. I mean, you and I have argued from the very beginning, support the troops, bring them home, because what are they dying for? Look what they've died for in Iraq. I mean, Iraq is no better. In fact, arguably it's much worse than under Saddam Hussein. Afghanistan, you've got the CIA carrying bundles full of cash secretly without even telling the American people. Now, you see all these businessmen that get indicted for bribing public officials. Here's the CIA bribing this corrupt dictator, unelected dictator, because every election over there has been fraudulent to the max. I mean, that to me pictured everything. And so we're over there, the government's over there. It kills people in the process of supporting this dictatorship. That results in the retaliation. That brings about the torture, the loss of civil liberties for the American people. And I think that's where we need to be debating. Now, it's important to address the torture, just like it's important to address the assassinations, the drone assassinations and the occupations. But I think this is what distinguishes the Future of Freedom Foundation, that these are medium-sized tumors, but the big tumor is this whole idea of the national security state, policing the world, serving as empire around the world, military bases, invasions, occupations, sanctions, embargoes. That's the root of the problem, Sheldon, as far as I'm concerned.
No, and I think if we could even maybe broaden that even more, I think it's the indispensable nation or American exceptionalism attitude. Because the national security state, it seems to me, is justified, at least in their own minds, on the grounds that we're the indispensable nation. So the rules are different for us. The world can't do without a big, America observing and monitoring and policing everything. So therefore, the rules are different for us versus every other, government. I think that's really how they think of it. If we weren't exceptional, then you're right. They might concede your point, say, sure, the rules should be the same for us as everyone else. But no, they're not. We are the exception. And I think that's a very dangerous attitude, because it licenses conduct which we would condemn in anybody else. And the U.S. government's very good at condemning other governments of torture and misconduct when they're not allies of ours, of course. But the rules are totally different for them. And I think they've justified it in their own minds. They've rationalized it because to them, we're the glue that holds the world together. And so therefore we have to do this stuff or else the world would fall apart.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, because, I've often said, look at Switzerland. That's, to me, is the model. And the founding fathers looked to Switzerland as a model when they were calling the federal government into existence. But it is oriented toward only national defense. They don't sanction, embargo, invade, occupy. They don't support dictatorships. They just are entirely oriented to national defense. And so, hey, at the very minimum, let's just bring all the troops home and see what happens. There's all these predictions. Oh, these horrible things will happen. Well, they predicted the same thing when the troops were in Vietnam. Oh, if they get out of Vietnam, the dominoes will fall and the communists will take over America. I don't even know of one single terrorist attack that any Vietnamese has conducted against the United States since the U.S. Troops were forced out of Vietnam. As soon as they were out, that was it. People went along with their business and did not engage in that terrorist retaliation. And the other thing, Sheldon, I wanted to point out is that for libertarians, libertarians, our goal is the achievement of a free society here in America. And that is, the point has to be made that as long as there is unlimited government overseas, it is impossible to achieve freedom at home. So any libertarian that says, no, we've got to have this unlimited government over there, fine, if that's what you want to do, but stop, devoting your life to achieving freedom, because you're trying to achieve a contradictory thing. You cannot have a free society at home and unlimited government at home, limited government abroad.
Yeah, it was a point made by Thomas Johnson that, ultimately you'll live under the empire. Either you get rid of it or you live under it. And you can't separate the two things. And when we know this. We know that they invoke these extraordinary powers in the name of the U.S. making the world safe. I mean, that's how they present it. So there's no separation. We can't. And this is something Compton and Bright pointed out in the 19th century when they were fighting the British Empire, and they were explicitly relating peace and non-intervention with free trade and reform at home. And by reform, they meant, liberal reform, stripping away government power so that people were free to engage in, live their lives peacefully. They made it one case. And that's something the libertarian movement often has not done. They've seen it as separate. And there have been libertarians who think you can compartmentalize foreign policy and domestic policy. And we need to rediscover the old wisdom by Cobden and Bright and Bastiat that it's all one integrated whole. You can't separate them.
Yeah, and John Quincy Adams said the same thing in that famous address in Search of Monsters to Destroy to Congress to celebrate the 4th of July. He says, once America turns in that direction, or were to turn in that direction of policing the world and going abroad in search of monsters to destroy, and there are a lot of monsters around the world, that's going to then change America. It's going to change America to the dark side. He said America will become a dictatress. And it's true. Look at the dark side in which we've been led with torture and assassination. And this is what happened. And Cobden and Bright, as you point out, and John Quincy Adams and Bastiat, I mean, they all would have argued the same thing. In any event,
I'll drop another name.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Okay. I was going to drop one more name for a few decades after Quincy Adams. We had William Graham Sumner write his beautiful essay, which you can look up on the internet, called "The Conquest of the United States by Spain," which he wrote, during the Spanish-American War. And even though it was clear the U.S. was going to win that war, he said, "But we're becoming Spain. We've adopted all of the vices of that decaying empire, and that's what we won in this war."
Yeah, that's a great point. And we've often said that the Spanish-American War was a major turning point toward empire. The seeds were planted, and of course, we've seen this giant rotten tree grow from those seeds. In any event, Sheldon, we're out of time. Thanks for the show, and thank you for tuning in. If you're new to the Future of Freedom Foundation, we have a free daily publication called the FFF Daily. You can subscribe at our website at fff.org. We have a monthly journal for subscriptions, and we thrive with donations. And if you like our work, we'd greatly appreciate you supporting us. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next week.